Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The saloon doors of Deadwood Gulch cracked open and the whole room went quiet. Jane Canary stood in the frame, mud on her boots, blood on her sleeve, and a dead man's rifle slung across her back. Every eye turned. A gambler named Otis Vane laughed first, loud and cruel, tipping his chair back. "Well, look what crawled out of the ditch," he sneered. "Somebody tell the lady this ain't her kind of place." The room laughed with him. Jane did not flinch. She walked to the bar like she owned the floorboards beneath her boots. She had just buried a 12-year-old boy an hour before, a boy no doctor in town would touch, because smallpox scared them worse than bullets. Her hands still smelled of lye soap and grave dirt. Otis didn't know that. Otis didn't care. He rose from his chair, swaggered close, and spat, right at her feet, inches from her worn leather boots. "Go on home, Calamity," he said, using the name the town threw at her like an insult. "Ain't no place here for a woman who buries paupers and drinks like a mule skinner." The saloon held its breath. Jane looked down at the spit in the dust, then back up at Otis Vane, her grey eyes steady as stone. She had been called worse by better men. She had ridden with soldiers who doubted her, buried children other people wouldn't touch, and slept in blizzards that killed grown men twice her size. A single insult from a card sheet in a smoky saloon was nothing, but something in his voice, something practiced, something rehearsed, made her pause. This wasn't random cruelty. Someone had paid Otis Vane to humiliate her, right here, right now, in front of the whole town. "You finished?" Jane asked quietly. Her voice barely rose above the crackle of the fireplace, yet it silenced every whisper in the room. Otis's smirk faltered for half a second, just long enough for Jane to notice the folded bill sticking from his vest pocket, crisp and new, nothing like the worn money passed around Deadwood's tables. Someone wanted her broken. Someone wanted her gone. And as her eyes lifted toward the shadowed corner booth near the window, she saw a figure rise, tip his hat low, and slip out into the freezing dark before she could see his face. The wind outside howled through Deadwood's muddy streets, rattling tin signs and scattering old newspapers, past the boots of men who pretended not to watch. Jane's hand drifted toward her belt, toward the cold iron resting there, though she did not draw it. Not yet. Whoever had paid Otis Vane wanted a reaction, wanted a scene, wanted the town to remember Calamity Jane as a wild animal to be caged or driven out. She would not give him that satisfaction. But as she turned toward the saloon door, boots echoing on the wooden floor, she whispered 4 words under her breath that no one in the room heard, words that would carry her into the deadliest winter of her life. "This ain't over yet." 3 years earlier, before Deadwood, before the whispers and the wanted men, there had been a wagon train crawling across the Wyoming plains, and a girl of barely 14 holding the reins because her father's hands shook too badly to hold them himself. Her name back then was simply Martha Jane, daughter of a failed farmer named Robert Canary, a man broken by drought and debt long before the frontier broke him for good. Her mother had died on that same trail, buried beneath a pile of stones, with no marker, no prayer book, nothing but Jane's tears to mark the spot. The wagon train elders whispered that the Canary family was cursed, that trouble followed them like a shadow with teeth. Jane heard every word. She learned early that grief made people cruel, that a family too poor to bury its dead properly became a family other families avoided at the campfire. She swallowed her sorrow the way she swallowed dust, silently and often. At night, while her younger brothers and sisters slept in the wagon bed, Jane sat outside with her father's old rifle across her knees, watching the darkness for wolves, for raiders, for anything that might take what little her family had left. Her father died 2 winters later in a rented room in Salt Lake City, coughing blood into a handkerchief, while Jane held his hand and promised him she would keep the family together. She was 16. She had 5 younger siblings, no money, no husband, and no trade a respectable woman was permitted to practice. So Jane did what no one expected. She cut her hair short, borrowed a man's coat, and took work no one else wanted. Driving oxen, scouting trails, nursing sick miners nobody else would touch. She became, in the eyes of polite society, something unclassifiable. Neither lady nor outlaw, just Jane. It was during those hard years, hauling freight through Wyoming territory, that the name found her. Her wagon overturned on a canyon road, and soldiers scattered in panic as an officer named Captain Egan tumbled from his horse into the path of danger. Jane didn't think. She rode straight into the chaos, hauled the wounded captain onto her saddle, and pulled him clear before the wagon crushed the space where he'd fallen. Bleeding and grateful, Egan supposedly laughed through his pain and called her the heroine of the plains, the woman who defies calamity itself. The nickname spread faster than any newspaper could print it. Calamity Jane. She hated it at first. It sounded like a curse dressed up as a compliment, a way for men to make her legend smaller, stranger, easier to laugh about in saloons. But Jane learned something else in those years too, something that would matter later in Deadwood, when Otis Vane spat at her boots. She learned that the world would always try to name her, define her, shrink her into something they could dismiss. And she learned that the only real power she had was refusing to let their words decide who she truly was. By the time she rode into Deadwood Gulch years later, Martha Jane Canary was gone. Only Calamity Jane remained, forged, not born in fire. Deadwood in 1876 was a town built on greed and gold dust, thrown together so fast that the streets still smelled of raw pine and unwashed men. Jane arrived that spring, driving a supply wagon, her reputation trailing behind her like smoke. She had heard the whispers already. Half the men called her a legend, the other half called her a disgrace, and both sides seemed to enjoy saying it loudly. Jane paid them little mind. She had learned to walk through judgment the way she walked through blizzards, head down, jaw set, moving forward no matter how hard the wind screamed against her. But nothing prepared her for what waited in Deadwood's shanty rows that August. The sickness. Smallpox swept through the gulch like wildfire, striking miners and children alike, filling tents with fever and the smell of rot. The town's only doctor, a nervous man named Silas Pruitt, refused to enter the infected quarter. "I have a family," he told the mayor, refusing even to look toward the sick tents. "I won't risk them for drunkards and orphans." The sick were left to suffer alone, their doors marked with red rags as warning, their names slowly forgotten by a town too frightened to remember them. Jane walked into that quarter when no one else would. She didn't ask permission. She simply arrived one gray morning with a bucket, clean rags, and a jar of carbolic salve she'd bought with money meant for her own boots. She nursed strangers through fevers that turned their skin to fire, held the hands of children whose parents had already died, and buried the ones who didn't survive with her own aching hands, because the undertaker charged fees the dying couldn't pay. Word spread through Deadwood. Not the mocking kind of word this time, but something quieter, more uncertain. Something like respect nobody wanted to admit out loud. Among the sick was a boy named Eli Thorne, orphaned when the fever took both his parents within 2 days of each other. He was 12, thin as a fence post, and terrified of dying alone like his mother had. Jane sat beside his cot night after night, wiping his forehead, telling him stories of the plains, of wolves outsmarted and rivers crossed, anything to keep his mind from the fear crawling under his skin. "You ain't gonna die alone, Eli," she told him one night, her voice rough with exhaustion. "Not while I'm breathing, that's a promise." He believed her. For 11 days, that promise was the only thing keeping either of them steady. On the 12th night, Eli's fever broke, but not the way Jane had prayed for. He slipped away just before dawn, his small hand still curled inside hers, calm at last after days of suffering. Jane sat with his body until the sun rose fully over the gulch, refusing to let anyone move him until she herself had washed him clean and wrapped him with what dignity Deadwood could offer a boy nobody claimed. It was that same morning, raw with grief and grief-borrowed anger, that she walked into the saloon and met Otis Vane's cruelty with silence, because Jane had learned something Deadwood hadn't figured out yet, that a woman who has buried children with her own hands fears very little that a saloon full of cowards could ever say to her. The figure who slipped from the saloon shadows that night was not a stranger to Deadwood, though few had seen his face clearly enough to describe it. His name, whispered only among men who valued their silence, was Harlan Cobb, a former army paymaster turned claims speculator, a man who had built his fortune buying up mining rights from desperate widows and dying prospectors for pennies on the dollar. Cobb had eyes on the richest vein in Deadwood Gulch, land legally belonging to the very sick quarter Jane had spent weeks nursing back from the edge of death. And Jane, without ever meaning to, had become the only obstacle standing between Cobb and his fortune. The dying miners in that quarter had, in their final days, signed their claims over to Jane, not out of romance or reward, but out of simple gratitude, because she was the only person who had shown them kindness when the town turned its back. Land nobody else wanted suddenly, quietly, belonged to Calamity Jane. Cobb discovered this through a drunken clerk at the assay office, and the discovery had turned his stomach cold with fury. A woman, an uneducated, unmarried, dust-covered woman, now held legal claim to the vein he'd spent 2 years maneuvering to steal. He would not allow it to stand. Cobb's plan was simple and cruel: humiliate her publicly, question her sanity, paint her as a lawless drunk unfit to hold property, and force the courts to strip the claims away for her own protection. Otis Vane was merely the opening move, a paid insult meant to provoke Jane into violence in front of witnesses, violence that could be used against her in a territorial courtroom. Cobb had underestimated one thing. He assumed Calamity Jane was ruled by her temper. He did not know that grief, real grief, the kind carved into a person by burying a child with their own hands, teaches patience that fury never could. That night, after leaving the saloon, Jane didn't return to her room above the trading post. Instead, she rode out through the darkness to the sick quarter, past the rows of tents now empty and silent, toward a small wooden marker she'd carved herself. Eli Thorne's grave, the only one in Deadwood with a name burned into the wood by candlelight. She knelt in the cold dirt and told him what she'd learned that evening, speaking to the dead the way lonely people often do. "Someone wants what these folks gave me, Eli," she whispered. "Wants it bad enough to send a coward to spit at my boots. I ain't letting him have it." Miles away, in a lantern-lit office above the assay building, Harlan Cobb poured himself a glass of brandy and studied a map of the gulch, red ink circling the claims he intended to seize. He had already sent word to a territorial judge he owned outright, already arranged for 2 hired men to encourage Jane toward a mistake he could exploit. What Cobb did not know, could not have known, was that Jane Canary had survived drought, orphaning, epidemic, and a decade of frontier cruelty that would have broken stronger men entirely. He believed he was hunting a wild, reckless woman. He was, in truth, about to collide with the only person in Deadwood Gulch who had absolutely nothing left to lose. 3 days after the saloon incident, a note arrived at Jane's door, slipped beneath it sometime in the night while she slept with one hand curled around her rifle out of old habit. The note was unsigned, the handwriting neat and deliberate. Too neat for a miner, too careful for a drunk. "Sell the claims quiet or lose them loud," it read. Jane read it twice by candlelight, then fed it to the flame and watched the paper curl to ash. She had faced blizzards that whispered the same threat in colder language. A piece of paper did not frighten her, but it told her something valuable. Her enemy preferred shadows to daylight, which meant he could be drawn into the open. She began asking careful questions around town, not with accusations, but with the quiet patience of someone who had learned to listen before speaking. The bartender at the saloon, a soft-spoken man named Desmond Pryor, mentioned that Otis Vane had been flush with cash lately, more than his card winnings could explain. A stable hand mentioned strangers, asking after the woman with the sick quarter claims, men who didn't fit the usual mining crowd, clean boots, city coats, the kind of men who worked for someone richer than themselves. Piece by piece, Jane assembled a picture of a man hiding behind other men's faces, too careful to show his own. That Thursday evening, Otis Vane cornered her outside the trading post, no longer smirking, his confidence replaced by something closer to nerves. "You ought to take the offer," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder like a man being watched. "Whoever's behind this, Jane, he don't lose, not ever." For the first time, Jane heard something honest in his voice, not cruelty, but fear. She studied him a long moment, then asked quietly, "How much is your soul worth these days, Otis?" He couldn't meet her eyes. He walked away without answering, and Jane understood then that even her enemy's foot soldiers were being crushed beneath the same boot, threatening her. That night, gunfire cracked through the darkness near the sick quarter. 2 shots, wild and careless, striking the wooden marker above Eli Thorne's grave and splintering it clean in half. Jane heard the shots from her window and was on her horse within a minute, riding hard through the mud toward the graveyard, her heart hammering with a fury sharper than any fear. She found no one there, only hoofprints leading east and the shattered marker lying broken in the dirt, Eli's carved name split down the middle. Jane knelt in the mud and pressed the broken wood back together with shaking hands. and something inside her that had remained calm through every insult finally, quietly, caught fire. She rode back into town before sunrise, mud-streaked and hollow-eyed, and walked straight into the sheriff's office without knocking. Sheriff Amos Whitlock, a tired man more accustomed to breaking up card fights than uncovering conspiracies, looked up from his desk in surprise. "Someone shot up a dead boy's grave marker last night," Jane said flatly, laying the splintered wood on his desk like evidence in a courtroom. "And I intend to find out who, Sheriff, with or without your badge helping me." Whitlock studied her face for a long moment, saw something there that silenced whatever excuse he might have offered, and reached for his hat. Deadwood Gulch, without quite realizing it yet, was about to watch its quietest war become impossible to ignore. Sheriff Whitlock's investigation moved slower than Jane's patience allowed, so she began her own, quiet, careful, built on the same instincts that had kept her alive on the plains. She started with Otis Vane's fear, following it like a trail of broken branches through the underbrush. Vane, cornered again outside the livery stable, finally cracked under the weight of his own guilt, whispering a name he'd been terrified to speak aloud: Harlan Cobb. Jane didn't recognize the name immediately, but a widow named Prudence Aldridge, whose husband had died of the fever and left his claim to Jane out of gratitude, went pale the moment she heard it spoken. Prudence Aldridge invited Jane into her small cabin that evening, hands trembling as she pulled a worn ledger from beneath a floorboard, records her husband had secretly kept before he died, documenting years of Cobb's dealings. Names of widows pressured into selling claims for almost nothing, threats disguised as business offers, a pattern stretching back to 3 separate mining camps before Deadwood, each one left poorer while Cobb grew richer. "My husband was afraid to speak out," Prudence whispered, her eyes wet. "Afraid of what Cobb's men would do to me if he did. He wanted someone brave enough to finish what he couldn't." Jane studied the ledger by lamplight long into the night, her jaw tightening with every entry, every stolen claim, every widow left with nothing. This wasn't only about her or Eli's grave or the sick quarters land. Cobb had been quietly bleeding Deadwood Gulch dry for years, hiding behind polished manners and a respectable coat, while men like Otis Vane did his dirty work in saloons and shadows. Jane realized, with a clarity that steadied her racing heart, that this fight was no longer about protecting one claim. It was about protecting every family in Deadwood, too frightened or too poor to protect themselves. She brought the ledger to Sheriff Whitlock the next morning, watching his tired eyes widen page by page as the scale of Cobb's scheme unfolded before him. "This is enough to hang him," Whitlock muttered, though his voice carried more caution than confidence. "If the judge ain't already bought." Jane's stomach turned cold at those words. She remembered Vane's warning, "Whoever's behind this, he don't lose," and understood suddenly how deep Cobb's reach might run. A ledger alone would not be enough. She needed something Cobb couldn't buy, threaten, or silence. She needed the truth spoken loudly enough that Deadwood itself could not look away. That afternoon word reached Jane that Cobb had requested an emergency hearing before the territorial judge, demanding immediate seizure of the sick quarter claims under the pretense of protecting unstable property owners from themselves. The hearing was set for 3 days later in the crowded courthouse at the center of town, where every miner, gambler, and gossiping neighbor in Deadwood would be watching. Jane read the notice twice, feeling the old familiar coldness settle into her spine. The same steadiness that had once driven her into a canyon to save a falling captain. The same stillness that had let her bury a child without breaking. Cobb wanted a public spectacle to destroy her. Jane decided, quietly, that she would give him one instead that destroyed him. The Deadwood courthouse had never held so many people at once, its wooden benches groaning under the weight of miners, shopkeepers, and gamblers who had abandoned their tables to watch the spectacle unfold. Harlan Cobb sat at the front in a pressed grey coat, calm as still water, flanked by two hired lawyers who barely glanced at Jane as she entered. Judge Elias Vance, a man whose reputation for fairness had quietly eroded under years of unspoken favors, rapped his gavel and called the hearing to order. Jane sat alone at her table, dressed plainly, the widow's ledger resting closed before her like a loaded weapon she hadn't yet chosen to fire. Cobb's lawyer opened smoothly, painting Jane as a reckless, unstable woman unfit to manage property, citing her reputation, her drinking, her unmarried status, weaving half-truths into something that sounded, to unfamiliar ears, almost reasonable. Whispers rippled through the courtroom, some sympathetic, others cruel, and Jane felt the old sting of being reduced to a rumor rather than a person. She kept her hands folded, her breathing steady, waiting the way she'd once waited out blizzards, patient, unbothered by the storm because she trusted her own strength to outlast it. Cobb allowed himself the faintest smile, certain the outcome was already decided. When her turn came, Jane rose slowly and did not raise her voice. She spoke instead of Eli Thorne, of nights spent nursing strangers no one else would touch, of a boy's small hand curled inside hers as dawn broke over an empty tent. She spoke of Prudence Aldridge's husband, dead of fever, and the ledger he'd hidden beneath his floorboards out of fear for his own wife's safety. Then she opened the ledger and began reading names aloud, widow after widow, claim after claim, each one a quiet theft dressed up as fair business. The courtroom's whispers died into stunned, uncomfortable silence. Cobb's composure cracked for the first time, his jaw tightening as Jane read his own words, back to him from his associate's letters, preserved carefully in the ledger's pages. "This woman is fabricating documents to protect stolen property," he snapped, rising from his seat, his voice sharper than before. But Prudence Aldridge stood then from the gallery, her voice shaking but clear, confirming every word, every threat her husband had endured. One by one, 3 more widows rose behind her, each confirming names, dates, and threats, matching the ledger exactly. Judge Vance, sweating now under the courtroom's collective gaze, could no longer pretend the matter was simple. The gavel came down not in Cobb's favor, but in an order for a full territorial investigation, freezing every claim Cobb had acquired across 3 counties pending review. It was not the instant justice Jane had hoped for. Cobb walked free that day, his fortune merely frozen rather than seized. But something had shifted permanently in Deadwood Gulch. The town that once called her Calamity, spitting the name like an insult, now watched her walk out of that courthouse in absolute silence, no longer certain what to call a woman who had just single-handedly dragged their town's ugliest secret into the light. Harlan Cobb did not accept defeat quietly. 2 nights after the hearing, while Deadwood slept beneath a sky heavy with early snow, 2 of his hired men crept toward the sick quarter with torches and coal oil, intent on burning the tents and records that remained, proof witnesses, anything connecting Cobb to his years of quiet thievery. Jane, sleeping lightly as she always did since Deadwood's troubles began, woke to the smell of smoke curling beneath her window, and was moving before conscious thought caught up with her body, rifle in hand, boots half-laced, heart hammering with a fear sharper than any she'd felt in the courtroom. She reached the sick quarter to find flames already licking at the canvas of the nearest tent. Two men silhouetted against the firelight, laughing as they splashed oil toward Eli Thorne's rebuilt grave marker. Something in Jane broke loose in that moment, not recklessness, but a fierce, focused clarity she had carried since childhood, since burying her mother beneath unmarked stones, since promising a dying boy he would not be forgotten. She fired a single warning shot into the sky, her voice cutting through the crackling flames like a blade. "Touch that grave again," she said, "and it'll be the last thing you ever touch." The two men turned, startled, reaching for their own weapons. But Jane had already closed the distance, moving with the same steady confidence that had once pulled a wounded captain from beneath a collapsing wagon. She struck the nearest man across the jaw with the butt of her rifle before he could raise his pistol, and the second hesitated just long enough for the sound of approaching hoofbeats to reach them. Sheriff Whitlock, alerted by a neighbor's shout, riding hard with two deputies behind him. Caught between Jane's fury and the sheriff's approaching lanterns, both men dropped their torches and fled into the darkness, leaving the fire to be smothered before it could spread further. Jane knelt in the mud afterward, breathing hard, watching smoke curl upward from the extinguished flames, Eli's marker standing untouched beside her, dented but whole. Whitlock dismounted beside her, his face grim in the lantern light. "Cobb's finished pretending to play fair," he said quietly. "This proves intent, Jane. Arson, attempted destruction of evidence. It's enough for a warrant." Jane nodded slowly, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the fight. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything she'd been carrying since that boy's small hand had gone still in hers. By morning, word of the failed arson had spread through every corner of Deadwood Gulch, and something remarkable happened. Something Jane hadn't expected and certainly hadn't planned. Miners who had once mocked her began leaving supplies outside her door. Shopkeepers who'd whispered cruel names now nodded respectfully when she passed. Even Otis Vane appeared at her doorstep that afternoon, hat in hand, offering to testify against Cobb in exchange for protection, his fear of Cobb finally outweighed by something closer to conscience. Deadwood Gulch, slowly and imperfectly, was choosing a side. And for the first time since arriving in that muddy, cold-hungry town, Calamity Jane did not feel entirely alone. The warrant for Harlan Cobb's arrest arrived from the territorial capital 11 days later, carried by a federal marshal named Cornelius Bede, a broad-shouldered man with little patience for frontier corruption. But Cobb, warned by a sympathetic clerk hours before the marshal's arrival, had already begun destroying what remained of his records, loading a wagon with strong boxes of gold and silver certificates under cover of darkness, intent on vanishing into the Black Hills before justice could catch him. Jane learned of his flight from Prudence Aldridge, who'd seen the wagon rumbling past her cabin just before dawn, and she made a decision that would define the rest of her life in Deadwood Gulch. She did not wait for the marshal. She saddled her horse and rode alone into the hills after Cobb, following wagon tracks through fresh snow with the same relentless focus that had once guided her across the plains as a grieving, orphaned teenager. She caught up to him by midday at a narrow mountain pass. His wagon wheel cracked against a boulder, Cobb himself standing beside it with a pistol drawn, his composed mask finally, completely shattered. "You should have taken the money and disappeared," he snarled, his voice raw with desperation neither of them had heard from him before. "You had everything to gain and chose ruin instead." "I chose a boy's grave over your gold," Jane answered, her voice steady despite the pistol aimed at her chest. "That ain't ruin, Cobb. That's the only thing in this territory that was ever worth choosing." Cobb's hand trembled on the trigger, desperation and fury warring across his face. And for one suspended breath, Jane genuinely believed the mountain pass might become her grave, just as it had nearly become Captain Egan's Canyon years before. But Jane had faced blizzards, fever, grief, and humiliation without breaking, and something in her stillness, her unshaken certainty, made Cobb's resolve finally, visibly crack. Marshal Bede arrived minutes later, having tracked Jane's hoofprints through the snow after realizing she'd ridden out alone, and found Cobb slumped against his wrecked wagon, weeping quietly, his pistol lying useless in the snow beside him, disarmed not by force, but by the unbearable weight of his own crimes finally catching up to him. Jane hadn't fired a single shot. She hadn't needed to. Cobb was arrested on the spot, his strong boxes of stolen gold catalogued as evidence, his years of quiet theft against Deadwood's widows and orphans, finally, undeniably exposed before the full weight of territorial law. The ride back into Deadwood Gulch that evening felt different than any ride Jane had taken before. Not triumphant exactly, but settled, like a debt long overdue had finally, painfully been paid. Word of Cobb's capture had already reached town ahead of her, and as she rode down the muddy main street, doors opened, lanterns lifted, and the same people who had once laughed at Otis Vane's cruel joke now stood silently in the cold to watch her pass. No one cheered. No one needed to. Deadwood Gulch understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly what kind of woman had been living quietly among them all along. Harlan Cobb stood trial that winter before a territorial judge who could no longer be bought, his crimes laid bare through Prudence Aldridge's ledger, Otis Vane's reluctant testimony, and the sworn statements of widows across 3 counties. He was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, his stolen claims and gold redistributed to the families he'd spent years quietly ruining. Prudence Aldridge received back the land her husband had died protecting. 3 other widows, strangers to Jane before that courtroom, wept openly when their claims were restored, their futures no longer resting in the hands of a man who'd counted their grief as profit. Jane herself kept only the smallest portion of the Sickwater land, enough for a modest cabin near the graveyard where Eli Thorne rested, his marker finally repaired properly by the town's carpenter, free of charge, engraved now with words Jane herself had chosen. He was not forgotten. The rest of the claim, the richest vein in the gulch, she signed over to a fund for Deadwood's sick and orphaned, insisting no single person should ever again hold that much power over desperate, dying families. Sheriff Whitlock called it foolish. Jane called it the only decision that let her sleep peacefully at night. Otis Vane left Deadwood that spring, his testimony against Cobb earning him neither forgiveness nor punishment. simply a quiet departure toward whatever life a frightened, complicated man could still build elsewhere. Jane never saw him again, though she heard years later that he'd become an honest rancher somewhere near the Wyoming border, a small redemption she chose to believe rather than doubt. Deadwood Gulch itself changed slowly in the months that followed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that the sick quarter no longer stood abandoned, and no doctor dared refuse a suffering patient again without facing the whole town's quiet judgment. Jane remained in Deadwood for years afterward, her reputation transformed from mockery into something closer to legend, though she never asked for the legend and never quite trusted it either. She continued nursing the sick, scouting for the army when called upon, and visiting Eli Thorne's grave every week without fail, sitting beside the small wooden marker and telling him quietly about the town he'd never lived to see grow kinder. She never married, never settled into the life polite society once insisted she should, want, and she never apologized for any of it. She had built something rarer than respectability. She had built a life entirely, unmistakably her own. Years later, long after Cobb's name had faded from memory and new gold rushes had pulled fresh crowds toward fresh hills, old-timers in Deadwood still told the story of the night Calamity. Jane walked into a saloon covered in grave dirt and let a coward's insult roll off her like rain off canvas. They told it differently depending on who was speaking. Some called her a hero, some called her a mystery, some simply called her unforgettable. But every version ended the same way, because every person who told it understood one unshakable truth about the woman at its center. The Wild West had thrown drought, death, disease, cruelty, and greed against her with everything it had. And in the end, it was Calamity Jane who remained standing, unbroken, exactly as she'd always been. The end.